The West Tower had been locked from the inside for 3 months, and nobody at Ashvale dared ask why. It was Edmund Carew who first noticed, on a morning in late October when the fog came low over the park and the lamps in the corridor had not yet been lit. He was walking before breakfast, as was his custom, moving through the long passage that connected the old wing to the new, when he heard the sound. Not a creak, not a settling of old stone. A voice, low and steady and unmistakably feminine, reading aloud to someone. He stopped at the base of the tower stairs. He had not stopped there in the 3 months since his marriage, had not thought to. The tower was old and damp, and had been used for nothing since his grandfather's time, or so Mrs. Hartwell the housekeeper had told him when he was 8 years old and full of questions. He had believed her. He had not thought to disbelieve her when he returned from London at 23 to inherit the dukedom, and he had not thought to disbelieve her still when his new wife arrived 6 months ago and asked him, in the careful way she asked everything, whether any room was forbidden to her. He had told her no. He had shown her the house in a single quiet afternoon, walking a half-step ahead and naming what each door contained, and she had followed with her hands clasped at her waist and her face composed and attentive, and neither of them had spoken of the East Nursery, which he passed without slowing. And she had noticed, and had not asked. He stood now at the foot of the tower stairs and listened to her voice, and did not go up. 2 hours later, in the breakfast room, his Aunt Honoria said to the cousin seated at her elbow, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for Edmund to hear, "One cannot account for it. The locked Duchess, they are calling her in the village, and one begins to understand why." She smiled at the cousin, and lifted her cup, and said nothing further. Edmund watched his wife's face. Cecily did not look up from her plate. Her expression did not change at all, and something about that stillness, the practiced quality of it, the composure she wore the way a soldier wears uniform, made him set down his own cup without drinking. He had married her in April, 6 weeks after the formal arrangement was concluded. He had not known her. He had known her situation, which was the situation of a great many young women in her condition. Father newly buried, small estate in Wiltshire swallowed by creditors, no brothers and no prospects. He had needed a duchess, not for himself, but for Ashval, for the tenants and the village and the 37 people employed in the house alone, all of whom required a functional estate and a functional marriage at its head to ensure their continued security. He had told himself this was enough. He had told himself he did not require more. He had not told himself why the East Nursery was still locked after 4 years. But that was a different matter. Cecily had arrived with a single trunk, a composure that was almost architectural in its precision, and a small painted miniature of a boy that she wore sometimes in a chain at her wrist and sometimes kept in her pocket. He had seen it once, when her hand fell open at the tea table. He had not asked about it. He had not asked about much. Their marriage had settled into a kind of quiet adjacency, each of them managing their separate rooms of the house without collision, without warmth, without conflict. He had told himself this was adequate. It was Mrs. Hartwell who told him, 3 days after the morning in the corridor, that the larder provisions for the upper house had been running light. "Candles, too, Your Grace. Not alarming, but I notice such things." He told her he noticed too, and that she should say nothing further. He did not tell her what he suspected. He did not yet know what he suspected. What he knew was that the candles were going somewhere, and the provisions were going somewhere, and his wife rose at 5 in the morning, which he had learned only because he had happened to be awake himself at that hour, standing at his window with the dark park below and the first indeterminate light coming in from the east, when he heard the soft, careful closing of a door. He had thought then that she simply slept badly. He had thought she was going to the library. He had thought a great many things that had nothing to do with the West Tower, and he had been wrong about all of them. Cecily Vane had come to Ashvale carrying a secret, and the secret was her brother. Thomas Vane was 21 years old and had, until 7 months ago, held a cornet's commission in a cavalry regiment stationed in Portugal. He was, as Cecily had known him her whole life, the best person she had ever met. He had their father's steadiness and their mother's quickness and a quality of loyalty that was, as it turned out, both his defining virtue and the instrument of his ruin. In the confusion of a skirmish outside a village Cecily could not pronounce, Thomas had broken from the advance to carry a wounded captain to the rear, an act that saved the captain's life and cost the advance its coherence. The captain had survived. The battle had not proceeded as ordered. Thomas was cashiered, his name entered into the regimental record as absent without order, the precise wording that meant cowardice to every ear that heard it. He had arrived at Ashvale on a night in July, thin and feverish and traveling under a false name, and Cecily had let him in through the servants' gate at 2 a.m. while her husband slept. She had not told Edmund. She had told herself she would tell him when Thomas was recovered. She had told herself she would find the right moment. She had told herself a great many things in the 3 months since, in the tower room that smelled of old stone and tallow, and the particular staleness of a space kept too long from windows and air. She had not told Edmund. If your comment here is simply that you are already in deep with her, already inside the weight she carries, hold that feeling. She was managing it, was the thing. That was what she told herself each morning as she rose at 5 and filled the small basket and carried it up the back stairs while the house still slept. Thomas was improving. The fever had broken twice, and twice returned, but the last week had been steadier. He was eating. He was reading the books she brought him. And once on a morning when the fog was particularly thick and the light particularly dim, she had come up to find him sitting upright against the wall with a Latin text open on his knee, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment and felt something so close to relief that her eyes had stung with it. He had stopped looking at her with the expression that said he knew he was ruining her and was sorry for it. She was managing. She was managing right up until the evening Honoria invited Lavinia Thorne to dinner. Lavinia Thorne was the woman Edmund's aunt had wanted him to marry. She was 23, well-connected, polished in the way of women who have been told since childhood that they are the correct choice, and she wore the knowledge lightly, almost kindly. She was not cruel. She simply moved through rooms with the settled certainty that they were designed for her comfort. And in that she was, Cecily thought, not so different from the rooms themselves. She had a particular quality of poise at the dinner table that Cecily had spent her girlhood admiring in other women and had long since given up attempting to emulate, the quality of a woman who has never had to calculate a sentence before she spoke it. The dinner was 8 people, Edmund at one end, Honoria at the other, Cecily in the middle beside a young baron she could not quite place, and Lavinia Thorne across from her with the candlelight gilding her throat. They were on to the fish course before Honoria said, in that carrying voice, "We were discussing the tower at cards the other evening, Miss Thorne. The West Tower. You will have noticed it from the park." "The round one?" said Lavinia pleasantly. "The locked one," said Honoria. "Locked from the inside, which is, you will allow, somewhat singular. We have been calling her the Locked Duchess." She said it without malice, or with only the malice that lives in perfect innocence. "It is just a bit of fun." Lavinia Thorne smiled. The young baron looked at his fish. At the far end of the table, Edmund set down his wineglass. Cecily felt his gaze before she saw it. It had been like that for some weeks. The specific awareness of where he was in a room. The way her breath adjusted without permission when he came close. She did not trust it. A man whose house she occupied by contractual arrangement had no claim on her body's attention, and she had told herself this too, and with about as much success as she had told herself all the other things. She met his eyes across the length of the table and said nothing, and looked back at her plate. That night she lay awake and listened to the house settle around her and thought about the miniature in her pocket, the small ivory oval with Thomas's face at 14, before the army, before Portugal. She had painted it herself, badly, but it was recognizable. She ran her thumb over the surface in the dark and thought about her father's voice reading to them on winter evenings. The particular cadence of it, the way he had always stopped at the difficult passages and asked them what they thought, rather than telling them, as if their answers mattered, as if they were worth consulting. She thought about what he would have said about the corner she had painted herself into. He would have told her to trust someone she did not trust easily. She had learned not to. The morning after the dinner, Edmund was not at breakfast. She found Mrs. Hartwell and asked in her usual way whether his schedule was altered, and Mrs. Hartwell said, "His Grace went up to the tower, my lady. An hour ago." The floor moved beneath Cecily's feet. Or that was how it felt, the sudden loss of solid ground, the understanding that the careful 3 months of management had arrived at their end by some route she had not anticipated. She went to the tower. He was not there. She found him instead in the corridor outside the tower door, standing with his back to the wall and his arms at his sides and his expression perfectly contained, the way it always was when he was working out something he did not yet wish to name. The door was closed. He had not gone in. She saw, looking at his face, that he had stood outside the door and heard her voice, and walked away again. And the decision to walk away rather than enter was the first thing about him that she had ever found she could not predict. He said, "You are reading to someone." She said, "Yes." He said, "Is it someone you want to tell me about?" She stood very still in the corridor with the cold stone at her back and the single window at the end, letting in the flat October light, and thought about her father asking them what they thought at the difficult passages. She said, "Not yet." He nodded once, slowly, as if that were an answer he could work with. He said, "All right." He started past her down the corridor. He stopped. His back was to her. He said, without turning, "If they are unwell, the physician from the village is discreet. His name is Dr. Parrish. You may send for him and tell Mrs. Hartwell it is at my direction." He walked on. She stood in the corridor for some time after he had gone, with the cold and the flat light and something that she could not yet name pressing warmly behind her breastbone. He had not asked. He had simply made it easier to manage. She had been wrong, she thought, to believe she understood him. 3 evenings later, on a night when the first real frost came in from the north and the fires in the house were inadequate to it, she came upstairs later than usual to find the tower door slightly ajar. Thomas had been feeling better and had grown careless. She had told him twice, and he had forgotten. She climbed the stairs and pushed the door open and found the room bright with a new candle, and Thomas asleep against the wall with a book across his chest, and his color finally, at last, looking like her brother's color, rather than the color of someone who had been slowly dying in a tower for 3 months. She stood in the doorway and let herself look at him for a full minute. She did not hear the step on the stair behind her. Edmund stood at her shoulder without speaking, and looked, as she was looking, at the sleeping young man in the too large borrowed shirt. And she felt the precise moment when he understood, because the quality of his silence changed, deepened, became the silence of a man who has just fitted the last piece of a long-standing puzzle into its place. She did not move. He did not move. He said very quietly, Your brother. Thomas, she said. Just the name, because there was nothing else to say. He looked for a long moment at Thomas's face, at the resemblance there, the same set of the jaw she saw when she looked in her own glass. And then he looked at her. His expression was not what she had expected. It was not anger. It was not the cold, formal assessment of a man calculating the legal and social consequences of what he had just discovered. It was something quieter and stranger than that. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that the person beside him has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has been too proud or too uncertain to put it down. He said, "How long?" "Since July." 3 months. He was quiet. "That is a long time to rise at 5 in the morning." She said nothing. He turned and went back down the stairs without speaking. And she stood in the doorway listening to his retreating steps and thought, "This is the end of it, then. He will send me away. He will not send Thomas away, because he is not a cruel man. But he will construct some arrangement that removes the problem cleanly and efficiently. And the arrangement will include her departure." She went back down to her room and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, and was very still for a long time. And then, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had not raised her to submit when submission was not required, she stood up and went to wash her face and went back downstairs. He was not in the library. He was not in the study. She found him eventually in the stable yard, in the last of the evening light, standing with his hand at the neck of the gray mare he kept for his morning rides, not doing anything in particular, simply standing. The horse nuzzled his coat pocket, and he let her and stood looking at nothing. He heard her footstep on the gravel and turned. She said, "His name is Thomas Vane. He is 21 years old, and he was a cornet in the 5th Cavalry. He was cashiered in Portugal in March for absence without order, and the absence was not cowardice. He carried a wounded officer out of a field under fire. The officer survived. Thomas lost his commission and his name." She stopped. She began again. "I could not leave him. I had nowhere else to bring him. I should have told you, and I did not. And I understand if that is not something you can look past." He listened to all of it with his hand still at the mare's neck and his eyes on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she heard the stable boy moving in the far stall and the distant sound of the estate clock marking the hour. Then he said, "Come inside. It is too cold to have this conversation in the yard." In the office, he listened again, this time to the full account, the regiment letter, Thomas's account of the skirmish, the captain's name. She produced the letter from the writing box she had brought downstairs and put it in his hands, and watched him read it twice. He set it on the desk. He said, "The officer he carried out. Is he traceable?" "I do not know his name. Thomas knew him as Captain Renwick." "Renwick," he said, and his jaw set in a way she had learned to read as thinking rather than anger. He said, "Leave it with me." She said, "This is your house and your name, and I did not ask you before I brought him here. I understand if that changes things between us." He looked at her then, properly, the full attention of him, and said, "Cecily." Just her name, without any of the careful distance he usually maintained. Then he stopped, as if he had not meant to go so far, and said simply, "Leave it with me." He found Colonel Brathwaite's direction himself that afternoon. He wrote 2 letters. He said nothing at dinner. He looked at his wife across the candle-lit table and thought about the tower, and thought about the East Nursery, still locked 4 years on, the key he still carried in his breast pocket, because he had not been able to put it somewhere he could not find it in the night. 2 locked rooms in a single house. 2 acts of private loyalty. 2 people who had each, for different reasons, decided that certain doors were better kept closed. He had not meant to tell her about Charlotte. He had not meant to tell anyone, which was to say everyone at Ashvale already knew, and no one spoke of it. Charlotte Carew, born Charlotte Selwyn, who had died in September of 1808 in the East Room while he was in London securing papers for the estate transfer, who had labored for 17 hours with only Mrs. Hartwell and the local physician, and her own considerable courage for company, who had given the child 3 hours of life before both of them were gone. He had arrived home to a house that was too still, and Mrs. Hartwell's face, and had understood, standing in the entrance hall with his coat still on and the autumn mud still on his boots, that he had trusted distance to make no difference and had been catastrophically wrong. He had locked that nursery. He had told Mrs. Hartwell it was the damp. He had told himself the same. He found Cecily in the library at 11 that night, which told him she had not slept. She was reading nothing, simply sitting in the chair beside the cold grate, with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the window. She did not hear him come in. He stood for a moment in the doorway and watched her. She was wearing a dark wool shawl that was slightly too large, and clearly not her own, borrowed from someone, probably Mrs. Hartwell, and her hair was unpinned on one side, which was not like her. The architectural precision of her usual composure undone in this small way. What he felt, standing there, was not a new thing exactly, but a more honest name for something he had been feeling for some weeks without permission. Something in the vicinity of aching. If you are still here, watching her at the window, you know what is building. So did he. He sat down. He told her about Charlotte. He had not planned to. He had planned to ask about Thomas's progress, about the regiment letter, about the practical matters. Instead, he told her about the 17 hours, about arriving home to the wrong quality of silence in the front hall, about the door at the end of the corridor that he had closed and not reopened, because to open it was to confirm what he had spent 4 years refusing to confirm. He had not been there when it mattered. He had trusted the distance between London and Ashvale to make no difference. The most important thing he was responsible for had ended without him, and partly because of him. She listened the way she did everything, with her whole body still and her attention complete. When he finished, she said, "The East Nursery." "Yes." "A locked room," she said. "For the same reason as mine." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Not exactly the same reason." "No," she said. "Not exactly the same. Close, though." He said, "I should have asked about the tower before now. I heard you that first morning. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and I did not go up." She said, "I heard you walk away. I thought you had decided not to know." "I thought," he said carefully, "that if you wanted to tell me, you would tell me. I was wrong about that." She said, "I should not have needed a tower." They sat for a while in the kind of quiet that is not empty. The candle between them burned down an inch, and then 2, and he did not get up to replace it. At some point his hand found the arm of her chair, and stopped there, not touching her hand, but close. The warmth of proximity across 2 inches of air. And she did not move away. She became very aware of the specific texture of the silence, the particular quality of a shared space that has stopped being contested, that has relaxed around 2 people who have each put something down. What she felt in her chest was the particular ache of something she had been trying not to feel for 6 months. She did not want to be managed. She wanted to be known. The man in the chair beside her, the silent, difficult man who had stood outside a locked tower door and walked away to make her comfortable, had been trying, in his clumsy, contained way, to know her for longer than she had given him credit for. She thought about her father and his questions at the difficult passages. She thought about Thomas's face by candlelight. She thought about the miniature in her pocket, badly painted, the thing she had made to keep a version of someone she loved close to hand. Here is another person worth keeping, she thought. The tower's secret held another 4 days before it broke. It was Honoria who found Thomas. She had gone up on a Tuesday morning while Cecily was at the village church with Mrs. Hartwell, and she had tried the tower door, and the door had been unlocked in the small, careless way of a man who has been feverish and is feeling better and has forgotten to be careful. Thomas was sitting up in bed with a book. Honoria stood in the doorway and looked at him, and looked at the basket beside the bed with Cecily's handwriting on the paper, and at the regimental journal open on the windowsill, and at the young man's face, and thought, this is it. She was in the drawing room when Cecily returned, seated upright in her usual chair with her hands folded and the particular composure of a woman who believes the cards are finally in her favor. She said what she had to say efficiently and without excessive cruelty, because Honoria was not, at her core, a cruel woman, only a certain one. Leave Ashvale quietly. Accept a formal separation on the grounds of incompatibility. Say nothing about the tower or its occupant. In return, Thomas Vane would simply never have been here. She would not go to the magistrate. She would not let the story reach the regiment, or the horse guards, or the morning papers. She gave Cecily until 4 o'clock. Cecily walked out of the drawing room and upstairs to the tower, and found Thomas reading his book with the particular peace of a man who has recently recalled that life can be managed, and she sat down beside him and told him. He said her name once, low and broken. She took his hand and held it for a moment, and then she said, I am not leaving. I want you to know that first. He looked at her. He said, Cecily, I'm not leaving, she said again. I should have trusted him sooner. That is my fault, not yours. We are going to see how it comes out. Then she went to find her husband. She found him in the stable yard, dismounted from his morning ride, handing off the gray to the groom, still in his riding coat with the cold of the morning in the fabric. He saw her face and said nothing, just held open the gate. In the office he listened. He had a way, she had noticed, of listening with his whole body arrested. The way a man listens who has learned that most words are evasion and is waiting for the one that is not. When she finished, he was quiet for a very long time. She watched something move behind his eyes, something that was not quite anger and was not quite calculation, and resolved into a kind of settled certainty she had not seen in him before. He said, I wrote to Colonel Brathwaite 2 days ago. He answered this morning. He put a letter on the desk between them. She read it. Captain Renwick was alive and in Bath and had been attempting, for 7 months, to locate his own regimental records to account for the man who had carried him out of that field. He had not known the man's name. He knew it now. I have written again, Edmund said. He will come. And there is a man at the Horse Guards who owes me a significant courtesy. She said, Honoria gives me until 4. Honoria, he said evenly, will be joining us in the drawing room at 3. She looked at him. She said, Edmund, he said, you did not ask me for help, Cecily. You should have. I understand why you did not, and we will discuss the rest of this later, when your brother's name is clear. Right now, I am going to write to Mr. Quelch and ask him to come from the village. And then we are going to the drawing room together, and you are not going to say anything unless you want to. He crossed the office in 3 strides and was beside her before she had quite processed what was happening. And he put his hand on her face, the flat of his palm at her jaw, steady and warm. And he tipped her head up and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not composed at all. That was, in fact, the least composed she had ever seen him. All of the careful distance gone from it. something raw and certain in its place. And then he let her go, and went back to his desk and picked up his pen. She stood in the middle of the office and felt her heartbeat in her throat. The drawing room at 3 held 7 people. Honoria in her usual chair, Lavinia Thorne arrived at 2 as Honoria's witness, the young baron from the dinner who had happened to call and been asked to stay. Mr. Quelch, the solicitor, at the table with his papers. Colonel Brathwaite arrived from a distance Edmund had not mentioned, standing near the window in his uniform coat. Edmund at the center. Cecily beside him, close enough that the wool of his coat sleeve was at her shoulder. Honoria looked at the colonel and at the solicitor, and understood quickly that the ground had shifted. She had not expected this. Her confidence lived in the assumption that Edmund's pride would do her work for her, that the threat of public disgrace attached to his name would be sufficient to remove a troublesome Duchess. She had not expected Edmund to choose otherwise. She had spent 4 years believing that he had chosen nothing and no one since Charlotte, and that the marriage to this unremarkable rector's daughter was a transaction rather than a preference, and that a transaction could be dissolved by the correct pressure applied at the correct point. She had not expected him to stand beside the rector's daughter with the sleeve of his coat at her shoulder and the full weight of his rank and his regimental connections assembled in the room. He let her say her piece. He let her deliver the ultimatum a second time, to the room, with all the precision and confidence of a woman who believed she was holding the stronger hand. He let the silence that followed it stretch long enough for everyone present to hear it plainly. Then he said, "My wife's brother is under my protection, and so is his honor." 12 words. Quiet. Absolute. The colonel stepped forward. Mr. Quelch produced the letter from Captain Renwick, properly attested. The colonel spoke for 4 minutes about Cornet Vane's conduct, about the captain's sworn statement, about the distinction between a breach of orders and a preservation of life in a situation no written order had anticipated. He used the words singular courage twice. He noted that the captain's statement had been in his possession for 3 months, and that the only obstacle to its formal presentation had been the absence of the cornet's name. The name was now supplied. Honoria was very still. The fan in her hand had not moved in 2 minutes. Lavinia Thorne sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at Edmund, and then at Cecily, and then at the window. She was not a cruel woman. She was simply a woman whose certainty had been organized around a particular outcome, and had just discovered the outcome would not arrive. She said nothing. She left shortly after the colonel finished, without drama, with a quiet dignity that Cecily in another moment might have admired. Honoria said, eventually, in a voice stripped entirely of its carrying quality, "You might have told me." Edmund said, "You might have asked." She left for Bath the following morning. The season would come and it would go, and the story would settle into the version Edmund had given it, which was the true version. The Duke of Ashvale's young brother-in-law had been wrongly cashiered in Portugal and would be reinstated at the Duke's personal intercession. The ton adjusted, as it always did, to the verdict of the most authoritative person in the room. Those who had used the phrase, "the locked Duchess," stopped using it. Those who had wondered whether the second Duchess of Ashvale would prove adequate revised their assessment toward something more like respect, though they would not have called it that. They would have said merely that she had proven herself steady under pressure, and that steadiness was a quality the Duke had always valued, and that perhaps the match was better suited than anyone had understood. Miss Lavinia Thorne was engaged by the following spring to a viscount from Northumberland, whose mother was a warmer woman than Honoria, and who took to Lavinia with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. Cecily heard this from Mrs. Hartwell, and was glad for it, genuinely, because Lavinia Thorne had done nothing wrong and deserved a house that felt like a choice rather than a consolation. Thomas Vane walked out of the West Tower on a Thursday in November, thin and unsteady and blinking in the pale November light, and shook the hand of his brother-in-law in the entrance hall with the particular solemnity of a man who does not yet have words. Edmund said, "There is a room in the East Wing prepared. You will stay until you are well. Then we will see about Bath." Thomas looked at Cecily. She made a face at him that said, "Do not cry, or I will," and he looked at the ceiling. He stayed 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks Cecily watched her husband and her brother sit across from each other at the dinner table and conduct the careful business of 2 reserved and loyal people learning how to be in a room together. Edmund asked about Portugal with the specific questions of a man who had studied maps. Thomas answered with the specific answers of a man grateful to be asked. By the end of the 2nd week, they were playing chess in the library after dinner, while Cecily read beside the fire, and the fire was warm and the candles were sufficient, and outside the frost was coming on properly, and she looked up from her book once and caught Edmund watching her across the chessboard with an expression that was not at all composed and did not pretend to be, and she held his gaze for a long moment, and then looked back at her book, because she was not ready, quite, for the conversation that expression invited, but she was close. Thomas left for Bath in the Duke's own carriage, with a letter of introduction to Captain Renwick, and the beginning of something that looked, tentatively, like a future. The West Tower door stood open after that, not wide open, not as a statement, simply ajar, the way a room is when it is no longer a secret. The old stone smell drifted out into the corridor and mixed with the cold of November and the wood smoke from the fires that Mrs. Hartwell had begun to light in the mornings, and it was on one of those mornings, 9 days after Thomas's departure, that Cecily came up the corridor to find Edmund standing at the foot of the tower stairs. He heard her and turned. He had something in his hand. She could see, even from the length of the corridor, what it was. The miniature. Small and ivory and painted badly by a girl of 17 who had loved her brother enough to try. She had left it on the tower mantel without thinking and had not gone back for it. She walked to him. He held it out. She took it and stood for a moment with Thomas's painted face at 14 in her palm, the boy with the steady dark eyes and the too big collar, and felt the whole weight of the last 7 months move through her like a current that has finally found its proper channel and can stop battering against stone. Edmund said, "He has good eyes. Your brother. He has my father's eyes. I should like to have known your father." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention she had come to recognize as his version of declaration, the full weight of him directed at her without any of the careful management that usually stood between them. She thought about the East Nursery, and about the key he had told her 2 days ago. He had moved from his breast pocket to a drawer. A small thing. A beginning of a small thing. She thought about the drawing room and his sleeve warm at her shoulder. She thought about her father's voice at the difficult passages, asking them what they thought. As if their answers mattered, she said his name. "Edmund?" He put his hand over hers, over the miniature, and held her fingers closed around it. He said, "Come inside, it is cold." It was. The November light was thin at the windows, and the fire in the morning room had not yet caught properly, and she let him lead her in out of the corridor, and felt the warmth begin to gather around them as the door swung shut, and thought of Thomas in a comfortable carriage heading south toward Bath, and a captain who had been trying for 7 months to say thank you, and thought of the tower door standing open behind them in the empty house, and thought of all the rooms that could now be entered. She set the lock on the mantel beside the fire, in the place where things are put when they are no longer needed. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and the texture of the quiet between them, which was not the quiet of adjacency anymore, but something else entirely, something with intention in it, something she had no word for in her father's vocabulary but recognized all the same. She did not pick the lock up again. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun. Not the heavy kind, but the quiet preliminary sort that lands without accumulating and disappears before you can be certain you saw it. The kind her father had always called a rehearsal. She watched it through the morning room window for a moment, his hand still over hers at the mantel, the fire finally beginning to catch at the grate behind them. If this story found something in you that you have been carrying quietly, leave it in the comments. It is safe there. And if you are new here, there is more. She had come to Ashvala with one small trunk and a secret, and no expectation of being chosen. She had been wrong about the last part, and that wrongness was the warmest thing she had ever been allowed to feel.